Broadwell E is out, and so are a whole bunch of new motherboards. The first motherboard I'm going to take a look at is the Asus Strix X99 Gaming. This is a brand new board from Asus, specifically for Broadwell E, but it's X99, which means that it'll work with other 2011 V3 processors. Let's take a look. So before I dive into the board, a quick word about the CPUs. Broadwell E, yes, it's a new X99 CPU, new process, new all sorts of fun things. But you say, wait a minute, this X99, I've heard of it before. I've heard of it before Skylake. Yes, that's right. X99 is the same chipset. It's just that there's a new set of CPUs that'll work in the old socket. So if you already have an X99 motherboard, chances are it'll support the new Broadwell E CPUs with a UEFI update. So we're going to take a look at some new boards though, some new boards and some refreshed boards that have come out, but all of our old reviews on all their old X99 stuff still apply. It's just that, hey, things have moved a little bit. Maybe there's some new peripherals, maybe there's some new features, and this is the Strix X99. So this is sort of a second generation X99 product. Asus sort of looked at all of the stuff that has, sold and done well in the past, and they've created this specifically for gaming, so it carries the Strix name. And so that suggests to me that it's, an enthusiast part, and it's upper, an upper echelon board, but it's not, the Deluxe. And there actually is a new version of the Deluxe called the Deluxe 2. There's also a new version of the A called the A2. So there have been some refreshes, some tweaks, but this is basically a new product, even though it is X99, and it's set up for Broadwell E, and it has some new and interesting features. So let's take a look. The first thing you should notice is the aesthetic. So this is basically completely black. And it's like, well, wait a minute, what about the orange? Okay, yes, it does come with orange on the PCH heatsink and on the cover, on the shield, on the back plate. But it comes with stickers, and so the stickers are sort of this orange color, this violent pink, sickness green, and this sort of black and silver color here. Now, if it were me, I would have shipped it with black and silver. Probably somebody saw this in the QA department and was like, orange. This has been an accent color, sort of a copper-ish accent color, I think is what they were going for, because we've seen that on some of the other ROG stuff. But somebody's like, we probably should include some stickers or something, so that is removable, and you can replace it. There's also an RGB LED behind the Republic of Gamers thing that you see here above the first PCI Express slot, as well as the Strix logo at the back. So you can use RGB lighting control and fun stuff with that. More about that in a minute. Let's take a look at the board layout. Now, if you're familiar with X99 from the prior generation CPUs, you'll know that they came in 28 and 40 lane varieties. That's no different, and because of that, some unusual things have to happen on the motherboard manufacturer's side to support CPUs that provide 28 PCI Express lanes as well as 40 PCI Express lanes. This motherboard's no different. It supports both 28 and 40 lanes. So the way that they deal with that is that they have different slots that have different PCI Express connectivity depending on what kind of a CPU you've got installed. So the first slot is a by 16 slot. It's also metal reinforced, and it is molded in with the plastic, and so this is obviously meant for your graphics card. If you're running a 28 lane CPU, this will be by 16. If you're running 3 graphics cards on this motherboard, then it's going to be a by 8 by 8 by 8 setup. With a 40 lane CPU, you end up running by 8 by 16 by 8. Yes, that's right. The middle slot is a by 16 slot when you're running a 40 lane CPU. Otherwise, it's by 8 by 8 by 8. Now, just a quick note about running 3-way graphics. It's 2-way SLI or 3-way Crossfire. NVIDIA has been kind of weird about supporting more than 2 graphics cards for gaming for SLI with the 1080, and so officially a lot of these things just say SLI, and so this just gives you 2 slots basically. But you could be running other peripherals, like I myself am running a by 4 HDMI capture card that can capture HDMI in 4K, and I've got another HDMI capture card that's just 1080p at 60 Hertz. That's a by 1 type interface. Also NVMe, that's a by 4 interface. And so if you're running a lot of PCI Express peripherals in your actual add-in cards, you sort of start to have to juggle the PCI Express lanes, especially if you've got a 28 lane CPU. And this motherboard shares resources in kind of an unusual way. Let's take a look at that. So the second PCI Express by 16 physical slot is labeled on the PCB PCIe by 4x1. So by default with the USB 3.1 controller, this slot that's physically by 16 will run it by 1, and also this by 1 slot next to the CMOS battery will also run it by 1. However, if you want to run this slot in by 4, it will disable the USB 3.1 controller, and it will also, I think, disable the PCI Express by 1 connector next to the CMOS battery, but then you can have the PCI Express lanes there. Similarly, it's got an M.2 slot, but the M.2 slot shares resources with the U.2, so you can't run the U.2 and the M.2 at the same time. It's sort of an either-or situation. Now, one other thing to note about this M.2 is that this M.2 supports PCIe SSDs only, no SATA support in this M.2 slot, so keep that in mind when you're shopping for M.2 disks. But if you're running NVMe or you're using an add-in card to carry out, if you're going to want to run a second M.2 or you want to run a second card, you can do that with the bottom PCI Express slot or even the PCIe X16_2 slot, which is right below the by 4 slot. It's just sort of an unusual thing that you have to keep in mind. Now, if you're running a 40-lane CPU, that opens up the other slots, but the by 4 slot is still, it's still that situation with the by 4 slot, owing to the fact that they didn't really want to deal with juggling that many PCI Express lanes. It's also true that the PCIe 1x1 slot, the by 1 slot immediately below the graphics card, shares bandwidth with the onboard Bluetooth Wi-Fi solution. Now, the onboard Wi-Fi Bluetooth solution is a 2x2 it's a 2x2 antenna, multi-in, multi-out. It also supports Bluetooth 4.1, Bluetooth Low Energy, and all of those standards. So I think this is actually probably okay, because you would never physically be able to use that by 1 slot with a double height graphics card. So while there is a by 1 slot there on the motherboard, it's actually also wired into the wireless controller. So if you're going to use the wireless controller at the back plate, that by 1 slot is effectively disabled. So I probably would not have even soldered it on the motherboard for this particular SKU, because you're not going to be able to use it if you're using this with a graphics card, unless you move your graphics card. And depending on where your graphics card's located, it's always going to be blocked. And you're never going to run a graphics card. You're never going to want to run a graphics card out of the PCIe X4 X1. So this layout is kind of unusual, but I really can't fault Asus for it, because they've got to support both the 28 and 40 lane CPUs, and they're just making the best of the situation that they can. Let's take a look at the back panel. Now, all the way on the left side, we've got the USB Bios Flashback. Now, USB Bios Flashback is a feature, if you're not familiar, that will allow you to update your UEFI even without a CPU. That might not sound like much, but on prior Asus motherboards, for example, if you have a Sabertooth or the X99A or the X99 Deluxe or some other X99 model from before Broadwell E came out, and you were to buy a Broadwell E CPU and you happen to get old stock on one of those motherboards, you would not be able to boot that CPU in the motherboard. Why not? Well, because the UEFI, the software on the motherboard, doesn't support the new processor, even though it's physically compatible, even though the software is compatible. So what you have to do is update the UEFI. Well, on some boards, when you're in that situation, you have to put an older CPU in, update the UEFI, and then you can swap in a new CPU. Hey, no problem for me. But most people don't have multiple generations of CPU lying around, especially ones that were so close together. So USB BIOS Flashback is this button, and this feature on a lot of Asus boards lets you update the UEFI without actually having a CPU. So there's an extra little sort of management processor on there. You can shove in a flash drive with a specially named flash file on it for the UEFI, hit the button, and the motherboard will update its UEFI while the computer is off, which is pretty cool. And then you will have CPU support, so you won't actually need an older CPU in order to update your system. Then we've got a combo PS2 mouse and keyboard port. So if you're into PS2 peripherals, like the old Model M keyboard that I love, you can just plug it in directly, which is awesome because it's hard to find that nowadays. Then we've got 2 USB 2.0 ports right below that, and then next to that we've got another 2 USB 2.0 ports. Then we've got our Intel i218V integrated NIC. And then at the back, we've got 4 USB 3.0 ports right below the NIC. Now, this is a really interesting setup here, too. One of these ports is wired into the Intel USB 3 controller provided as part of X99. You get 6 total. This motherboard implements 5 of the 6. The other 3 are through an ASMedia controller. So 3 of the 4 ports here are through an ASMedia USB 3.0 controller. The 4th one is through the Intel chipset. Then you've got your ASMedia USB 3.1 controller. You got one Type A port and one Type C. The Type C port provides up to 36 watts of power to use for quick charging a phone or whatever. Then you've got your 2x2 for the Asus Wi-Fi Go connection. This is 802.11 AC. Bluetooth 4.0, Bluetooth 4.1, Bluetooth 4.0 low energy support on the controller. And then you've got your Supreme FX sound solution with 5 analog out and SPDIF. Now the audio solution here is a Supreme FX 8-channel high-definition audio codec. It does have dual headphone amplifiers. It does have jack detection, multi-streaming, and front panel jack retasking. So with the software, you can do a lot of stuff. The audio solution does also feature sonic radar too. Let's take a look at the bottom of the edge of the board. Now the Supreme FX solution does feature the premium Japanese Nichicon capacitors, which is awesome. And right next to that, you can see that we've got the front panel connector. Now this is on an isolated part of the PCB, so that's a nice feature. We've got our RS-232 serial header, and then this is something new. There's an RGB header here, but we'll come back to the Rgb controller in a minute. This motherboard does have an onboard Rgb controller, which is pretty neat. I played with it. You got a power button, a reset button, a Q code readout, a TPM header, then our first of two USB 3 front panel header connectors. Then we've got our ROG headers. So this is for the ROG extension. You can plug that into this motherboard if you got the external ROG controller. Plug that into this motherboard and use it. And then right next to the ROG connection, you've got your USB 2.0 headers. So there are actually two USB 2.0 headers here. One that's sort of part of the ROG functionality, and then one that's sort of separated. So if you're running an internal thing like, an NZXT water block or a Corsair power supply that has the direct USB interface, you can use one of these two headers for those peripherals. Then you've got your front panel connector. Now just above the front panel connector, we've also got an input for a thermal sensor, not included in the box. But it's just an analog temperature sensor like the kind that came with the Sabertooth or other motherboards you can order separately. So if you want to have a sensor input, and you also have your direct key header. Now direct key is pretty neat. It's a button. You can wire in your reset button, for example, on your case, and when you hit reset, rather than resetting the system, it will take you into the UEFI on the next boot. So if your system's off, you can hit that, your system will turn on, you'll boot right into UEFI. Sometimes, especially with quick boot and things like that, you press delete over and over again. Doesn't really work that great because you have to hit delete over and over again, and the computer boots so fast it may not have seen you hit delete. So direct key is just a way to get into the UEFI. There are also software utilities, like if you're booting into your operating system, you can run a utility, and then on the next reboot you'll go into the UEFI as well. So you've got a lot of different options for getting into the UEFI. Just above that, you've got a Thunderbolt header, which we'll talk a little bit about Thunderbolt in a minute. And then you've got your XMP switch. Now, if you just flip the switch, it will put your RAM in XMP mode. So when it boots, it will use the XMP profile that's on your memory. Now, by default on Haswell E, it's 2133, Broadwell E, 2400. And so that's sort of the quote-unquote stock speed that the RAM runs at. But most RAM kits support a faster speed. And so, like, for example, I've got this G-Skill Trident Z, and this stuff will run at 3200, but the 3200 is part of the extreme memory profile. So normally you have to go into UEFI and toggle a setting, and that will work. But in this case, Asus has said, well, some people are intimidated by that. Let's just give them a physical switch. So you throw the switch, you get a light that comes on, and then bam, your memory is going to run at 3200 or whatever the XMP profile is. Now you can still change it in UEFI. You can still sort of reset the machine. Like if you're troubleshooting, you can still put it back to the default speed. But this physical switch lets you toggle between the two things. And then at the bottom, you've also got a 4-pin fan header that is compatible with a 3-pin fan. Now this does have the same exact features that you've come to know and love from Asus, where you've got full fan control in the UEFI, full temperature profiles, full fan utility, the whole 9 yards. This is great if you're running an alternative operating system like Linux, because you can configure all of the fan profiles and all of the stuff in the UEFI, and it's basically handled in hardware. There's also one other connector here, which is the Ext Fan Connector. The Ext Fan Connector lets you actually run more additional fans than will fit on the motherboard. The motherboard has 5 fan connectors plus 1 water pump header. And if you want to run more fans than that, or you want more than one temperature input, you can use this external fan header thing, and Asus sells a little board that will actually run more fans and more temperature sensors off of the little board. And so you can plug that in here, and it'll interface with the UEFI, and so it will give you more control over more fans if you want to run it that way. But 5 fans for most people plus a water pump should be enough. But if you're running some sort of super monster tower case and you want more control and you want direct control in the UEFI and you don't want to fiddle with any other utilities or any kind of USB peripherals, you got that connector. On the front edge here, we've got our U.2 connector. We've got 4 SATA ports. Then we've got 1 SATA Express port and 2 more SATA ports. And then you've got a USB 3 connector and then another 2 SATA ports. So in terms of SATA connectivity, I think this motherboard's got you covered. Then there's another fan connector, another 4-pin fan connector that's also, 3-pin fan compatible. And then you've got your ATX power connector. At the top edge here, we've got our Mem OK button. If the system's not posting and you want to check the memory and make sure that the memory is seated correctly, and maybe you just want to reset the memory parameters in your UEFI, you can hit Mem OK, and that will clear the settings only related to memory in your UEFI, and we'll try to give you an LED indication if your memory is okay. At the top edge of the board, we've got our 8-pin ATX power connector, but we also have another 4-pin eATX connector. A lot of power supplies have the 4-pin and the 8-pin separately. The 4-pin is not required, but if you're going to be doing extreme overclocking or you're going to be running a lot of peripherals, then you can run another 4-pin power connector in here and supply supplemental power, supplemental 12-volt power to your motherboard. And then in the top corner, we've got 3 more fan connectors for the CPU. One for the water pump, one for the CPU fan, and one for the optional CPU fan if you're running like a push-pull tower cooler or something like that. If you're running a dual fan radiator, you can run both fans off of the header here as well as the water pump. And that's pretty nice because you can get your fan readouts directly from the UEFI. Now, other notable features about the motherboard is that it does support up to 128 gigabytes of RAM, at least as of right now. Possibly it could support more in the future, but right now it's 128 gigabytes of RAM across 8 DDR4 DIMM slots. Now, this motherboard is rated at up to DDR4 3333, which is quite fast, but only non-error correcting memory. Now, one other feature to note about this motherboard is that it does actually support Xeon CPUs. Yes, that's right. If you pick up a socket 2011 V3 Xeon and drop it in here, you should double check the supported list on Asus's website because not every single Xeon under the sun is supported, but this motherboard does support the retail and OEM Xeons that you might pick up. However, it does not support engineering sample Xeons. It'll boot one time and then you have to reset the CMOS in order to get it to boot. So don't go on eBay and pick up engineering sample Xeons. But if you wanted to pick up a Xeon CPU, you could totally pick up a Xeon CPU. Now the desktop parts, honestly, the i7 CPUs for the most part will be in general a better deal, except for the Extreme Edition part. The Extreme Edition part is like $1,700. Good Lord. Hopefully the price will drop on that. But the i7 6800, one of the non-extreme parts will basically be okay. I mean, the 6800K is a 3.4 gigahertz base with a turbo of up to 3.8. It's pretty easy to overclock, hitting 4 gigahertz with the 6800K, not really a big deal. Yeah, that is a 28-lane CPU, but unless you're going to be running a lot of peripherals and dual graphics cards, you're probably okay. If you're going to be running a single graphics card plus NVMe plus an HDMI capture, 28 lanes is all you need. It's a lot better than the 16 lanes that you get on Skylake, especially if you're running a lot of peripherals. So something to keep in mind. All right, let's talk about Thunderbolt 3. So a lot of motherboards that we've seen with the X99 update are coming with the chipset called Intel Alpine Ridge. It's not built in on this motherboard, but you can get it in an add-in card. So Asus has Thunderbolt 3 on a Thunderbolt 3 add-in card. It connects through this Thunderbolt header that I showed you at the front part of the board, and that will give you a USB Type-C connection that supports Thunderbolt 3. So if you want Thunderbolt 3, you can get it, but you'll have to get it in the form of an add-in PCI Express card, which will take up one of your PCI Express slots on this particular motherboard. That said, it does support it, and so if you need to run Thunderbolt 3 peripherals, well, you just get an add-in card and do that. So let's talk about the RGB control. Now, this is technically not the first motherboard to feature this RGB control. The Hero 3 Alpha was the first board from Asus to feature this, but if you have a 50/50 LED strip, which is a pretty standard thing as far as LED strips go, you can control it directly from the motherboard. Included in the box is a header extension cable, and so if you're using a strip like this one here that we've got, this is just an RGB LED strip, standard issue, standard thing in the world. I picked this one up when I was in Taipei. It was about $15 American, give or take. And so this RGB LED strip, you just put in your case. You can anchor it down, you can glue it down. I think it's got sticky tape on the back of the LED strip here, so I can peel away the paper and then just stick this strip basically wherever on the inside of my case. And then I've got a lighting controller actually built into the motherboard that I can control with the Asus Aura software. The Aura software for this motherboard feels like a second generation product. You can have the LED lighting controlled based on the music that your computer happens to be playing. You can have it be controlled based on parameters of the system like CPU temperature. You can have it breathe, pulse. You've got a lot of different options in terms of what you want for control of the actual RGB lighting. there are also RGB LEDs underneath the locking mechanism for each of the PCI Express slots, and there are LEDs underneath the Republic of Gamers badge just above the first PCI Express slot, as well as the Strix logo at the back of the case. And so with all of these, you can use this for lighting effects inside your case. Now, me personally, a black box under my desk, I don't really care. Although I am working on a special project just to see what this RGB thing is all about, because it's not really my cup of tea, but if I'm going to try it, I might as well turn it up to 11 and see what happens. So if RGB is your cup of tea and you're really into RGB, I can see how having an RGB controller actually built into your motherboard is kind of neat. Now this controller is just an RGB controller, and so this is a multicolor strip. There are other kinds of LED strips out there, ones where each individual LED in the strip is addressable. But this particular setup on this particular motherboard is just a standard 50/50 strip, and the 50/50 strips are much less expensive than the individually addressable LED strips. So in terms of being able to run an RGB controller and have it respond to your system, then you totally have that option. And I fully expect Asus on the next generation to have also that be controllable through UEFI, 100% controllable through UEFI as well. So that'll be interesting to take a look at. Now, the first thing I will segue about before talking about the software is that Asus has really stepped up their game with their CPU installation assistance thing. So in the box is this plastic thing. We looked at this a little bit on Skylake, and it was just a plastic thing to sort of hold the CPU for you while you installed it to help make sure that you didn't accidentally install the CPU wrong. Asus has stepped it up a notch. They've got a custom socket on the motherboard, so if you're super paranoid about installing your CPU, or you're afraid that you're accidentally going to install your CPU wrong or put it in an angle and then crush some of the pins and then that ruins the motherboard at that point, you can use this mechanism. So what you do is you basically unpack the sticker and you stick a sticker on the bottom of your CPU to protect the pins, and then you put the CPU in this plastic retention clip thing, and then it snaps into the socket in sort of this open butterfly configuration, and then you just sort of gently lay your processor down in the CPU socket, and then the CPU socket sort of closes on top of the CPU. And this is really neat, especially if you're a DIYer and you're super scared about accidentally destroying the CPU socket, because it is super easy to accidentally destroy the CPU socket, and that's all on you. That's not going to be covered by warranty. That's all on you. So this is a really neat, interesting mechanism. This works a lot better than the first generation product that I took a look at, and so I really have to commend Asus on this. If this is something that you're super paranoid about being a DIYer, this will probably help you install the CPU without actually destroying your system. Don't forget to remove the sticker as you gently lay the CPU in the CPU socket, and you gently use the tension clips to close your CPU on it. It also makes it easier to remove the CPU. So if you get an upgrade 5 years from now and they haven't changed the socket, hint, they will have changed the socket, you could swap CPUs if you wanted to, and that would be completely fine. The other thing was the intelligent auto-tune overclocking software. So AI Suite, they've updated it again. The automatic overclocking software honestly is not bad. The automatic overclocking software with the 6800K was able to hit 4.3 gigahertz. It did push the voltage to 1.375 volts, which is maybe a little high, but this system ran for over an hour and had no stability problems whatsoever. That's like a 26% overclock for this particular CPU. Holy crap, that's really, really impressive that it was able to do that basically automatically. I could fiddle with it a little bit and push it farther, but I also had a tower cooler on it, and the tower cooler just couldn't keep up. So I would need a closed loop cooler or something if I was going to push it past 4.3 gigahertz. But if this is also a system that I want to be stable for the long term, then 4.3 gigahertz on a 6800K is probably about right. That's probably at the upper end of what is reasonable to expect. I mean, honestly, probably based on what we've seen, this is actually a pretty decent CPU in terms of overclockability. There are CPUs that won't hit 4.3 6800Ks. So overall, it's not too bad. But it was really impressive that the software was able to take it to 4.3. The farthest that I've been able to take it after hours of fiddling with it was 4.5 on a closed loop cooler. So the fact that it pretty much immediately got it to 4.3 is really good. Now this is a 6-core CPU. It did only take it to 4.3 on 4 of the cores. So I took it, I fiddled with it a little bit and was able to get 4.3 on the other 2 cores. But at 4.3, this system is basically, and Cinebench is basically the same speed as a 12-core X5650, which is a Xeon from like 4 or 5 generations ago. It's a really, really old Xeon. So overall, what's the verdict? Well, the board was pretty solid. There was a UEFI update out the gate. So like always, update your UEFI. Whenever you get a new machine, just don't even bother. Just update the UEFI. Before you install the operating system, before you do anything, update the UEFI. Everything basically went according to plan, and was able to install Windows without any trouble, was able to install Linux without any trouble, was able to just get through basic testing, and basically everything was okay. Really the only surprise I ran into is that the engineering sample Xeon that I managed to procure did not work in this board, but it works in pretty much every other board that I've tried. It just doesn't work in Asus boards with recent UEFI updates. So I don't know. Don't buy CPUs from strange people on eBay. That's the lesson there. So keep that in mind. But overall, if you're looking for this is a really solid board. I really like the black aesthetic personally because it's you know, if you don't want to use the RGB lighting, it's minimalist and not overly ostentatious. But if you want to go nuts with the RGB lighting, hey, you got the option. It's built into the motherboard. If that's your thing, then it'll totally do that. So I'm curious to know what you guys think, or if you picked one up, I'm curious to know what your experiences are. Share with the group over in the forums at techsyndicate.com. I'm Wendell, I'm signing out, and I'll see you there.